November 1942, Bunagona, New Guinea. The jungle was killing them faster than the Japanese were. American soldiers crouched in mud that sucked at their boots like quicksand. Rain hammered down through the thick canopy above. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds so thick that men breathed them in with every gasp. But the rain and the bugs were not the worst part. The worst part was the machine gun fire ripping through the trees every time someone tried to move forward. This is the story you clicked for. This is about how Australian soldiers broke every rule in the military handbook, fought without waiting for orders, and shocked their American allies by winning battles that seemed impossible to win. For 3 weeks, 14,000 Allied troops had been trying to break through Japanese defences. They were fighting against 6,500 Japanese soldiers who had dug bunkers so deep into the ground that bombs could not touch them. The Japanese had built these fortresses from coconut logs and packed dirt. They had positioned machine guns to cover every approach. Every path forward was a death trap. The Americans were dying in terrible numbers. When they attacked the way their training manuals told them to attack, 7 out of every 10 men got shot. 70% casualties. That meant if you went forward with your squad of 10 friends, only 3 of you would come back. The math was simple and brutal. The American commanders followed the rules exactly as West Point had taught them. Wait for orders from headquarters. Keep your formations tight. Coordinate every attack with artillery and air support. Move together as one organised force. Attack on schedule, not before, not after. These rules had won wars in Europe. These rules made sense on paper. But here in the jungle, these rules were getting men killed. The mud was so deep that soldiers could not run. The jungle was so thick that radios did not work half the time. Artillery could not see the targets through the trees. Air support could not tell friend from enemy in the green chaos below. And while the Americans waited for orders, waited for coordination, waited for the perfect moment to attack together, the Japanese sat in their bunkers and mowed down anyone who came close. American units would spend 6 hours trying to advance 50 yards. 6 hours of crawling, dying, and falling back. 50 yards of mud and blood. Then they would dig in and wait for new orders to try again tomorrow. Into this nightmare walked Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Honor. He was 39 years old and he commanded the Australian 39th Infantry Battalion. But Ralph Honor was not like the other commanders. He had not gone to a fancy military academy. Before the war, he had been a school teacher. He taught children how to read and write in small Australian towns. He knew how to explain hard ideas in simple ways. He knew how to trust young people to think for themselves. These skills seemed useless in a war. At least, that is what the American generals thought. General Douglas MacArthur ran the whole Allied operation in the Pacific. His staff officers looked at the Australian troops and saw problems. The Australians did not salute as crisply as American soldiers. They talked back to officers. They made jokes during briefings. They seemed relaxed, almost casual, even in combat. MacArthur's staff called them undisciplined militia. Some American officers said the Australians were not real soldiers at all, just civilians in uniform who did not understand military order. These experts were sure that only strict discipline and rigid obedience would win battles. They believed that soldiers who thought for themselves would create chaos. They believed that questioning orders was the same as cowardice. But Ralph Honor saw something different when he watched the fighting. He spent days observing the attacks, watching men die following the rules. He saw American squads waiting for radio contact that never came. He saw lieutenants frozen in place because they had not received permission to change the plan. He saw good men dying because they were waiting for someone far away to tell them what to do. And while they waited, the Japanese machine guns kept firing. Honor noticed something else too. The Japanese bunkers were impossible to destroy from the front. The coconut logs were too strong. The firing slits were too narrow. 100 men attacking straight ahead would all die without scratching the bunker. But the bunkers had a weakness. They could not cover every direction at once. The jungle was too thick. If a small group of men could move quietly through the trees, if they could slip around the sides, if they could get close without being seen, then maybe they could attack from an angle the bunker could not defend. Maybe they could throw grenades through the back entrance. Maybe they could fight smart instead of fighting hard. But here was the problem. Moving small groups through the jungle without radio contact meant those groups would be on their own. They could not wait for orders. They could not ask permission before making decisions. They would have to see the situation, think fast, and act immediately. Every soldier would have to be trusted to make choices that could mean life or death. Every sergeant would need to lead like an officer. Every private would need to think like a sergeant. This went against everything the military taught about command and control. This was exactly the kind of independence that MacArthur's staff said would create disaster. Ralph Honor sat in his muddy command post and watched the rain drip through the torn canvas above him. He listened to the distant rattle of machine gun fire. He thought about his students back in Australia, how he had taught them to solve problems by thinking, not by memorizing. He thought about trust. And slowly, an idea formed. What if the problem was not that his men were undisciplined? What if the problem was that everyone else was too disciplined? What if the rules that worked in other wars were the wrong rules for this jungle? What if winning meant teaching soldiers when not to follow orders? Honor called his officers together in the middle of the night. 10 men squeezed into a tent that leaked rain from 3 different holes. The air smelled like wet canvas and cigarette smoke. Honor spread a mud-stained map across an ammunition crate and pointed to the Japanese positions marked in red. He explained his plan, and it was simple enough that even the youngest private could understand it. They would break the battalion into small groups. Each group would have 10 men. These groups were called sections. Each section would get a target, not a list of orders. The section leader would decide how to reach that target. No waiting for permission. No radio calls asking what to do next. See the problem, think fast, solve it yourself. The officers stared at him. One lieutenant asked the obvious question. What if the sections got lost? What if they attacked at the wrong time? What if they hit each other by mistake? Hunter smiled. He said that smart men would figure it out. He said that sergeants who had survived 3 months in this jungle knew more about fighting than any general sitting in a clean office 10 miles away. He said that speed mattered more than perfection. A good decision made right now was better than a perfect decision made too late. The technical details were specific. Each section of 10 men would carry basic Lee Enfield rifles, 4 grenades per man, and 60 rounds of ammunition. That was not much. American units often had 3 times that much ammunition plus machine gun support. But Honor said less weight meant faster movement. Each section leader would carry a compass and a watch. They would be given a target location and a time. How they got there was up to them. They could go around. They could wait. They could attack from the side or the back. The only rule was to reach the target and take it. Everything else was their choice. On November 18, 1942, Honor decided to test the idea. He picked 3 of his best sections, 30 men total. He pointed to Japanese positions near Gona on the map. He told each section leader their target. 1 bunker for each section. He told them to move out at dawn. He told them to use their brains. Then he let them go. No detailed plan, no minute-by-minute schedule, just trust. The 3 sections disappeared into the jungle. Honor waited. He had no way to contact them. The radios did not work well in the thick trees. He could only listen to the distant sound of gunfire and hope his trust was not misplaced. 2 hours passed. Then a runner came back, The sections had moved 400 yards through the jungle, 400 yards in 2 hours. That same morning, an American unit using traditional tactics had spent 6 hours trying to move forward. They managed 50 yards. 6 hours for 50 yards. The Australians had gone 8 times farther in 1/3 of the time, but moving fast was only part of the test. Honor wanted to know if the sections could actually take the bunkers. By noon, the answer came back. All 3 sections had reached their targets. They had attacked from angles the Japanese did not expect. 2 bunkers were destroyed. 1 was captured. The 30 Australians had done in one morning what hundreds of Americans had failed to do in 3 days. The sections came back tired and dirty, but alive. They had lost 2 men. Only 2 out of 30. The math was completely different from the 70% casualties the Americans were taking. When word of this success reached American headquarters, Major General Edwin Harding exploded in anger. He called Honor's method chaos, not warfare. He said that soldiers who did not follow strict orders were dangerous. He said that this kind of independence would fall apart the moment things got hard. He predicted disaster. Harding sent messages to his officers telling them to ignore the Australian approach. He said that American discipline and American coordination would win the war, not Australian cowboys running wild through the jungle. But not everyone agreed with Harding. Australian General Thomas Blamey heard about the test and came to see Honor himself. Blamey was a tough old soldier who had fought in World War I. He had seen men die following stupid orders. He had survived battles where generals far from the front made plans that got good soldiers killed. When Honor explained his section tactics, Blamey nodded slowly. He said something that Honor never forgot. He said, "My men think for themselves because they must." He said that trust was not weakness. He said that the Japanese would never expect enemies who could adapt and change without waiting for permission. Blamey told Honor to keep going. He gave him official approval to train more units in the new tactics. On November 23rd, Honor launched the first major test. The Australian 25th Brigade prepared to attack. They organised into 15 independent sections, 150 men total. Each section got a target. Each section leader got a compass, a watch, and a handshake. No massive artillery barrage to announce the attack. No coordinated radio schedule. Just 15 groups of thinking soldiers moving through the jungle at their own pace, hitting targets when they saw the opportunity. The attack started at dawn. By 10 in the morning, chaos erupted across the Japanese lines. The Japanese defenders could not understand what was happening. They were trained to watch for big coordinated attacks. They expected to see large groups of enemies moving together. Instead, they faced small groups coming from everywhere at once. A section would hit from the left. Before the Japanese could respond, another section would attack from the right. A third section would appear behind them. The Japanese could not predict where the next attack would come from because the Australians themselves did not know until they saw the opportunity. By noon, 4 hours after the attack started, the Australians had captured 3 major Japanese strongpoints. 3 positions that had held back American attacks for days. The cost was real, but manageable. 40 men wounded. 8 killed. Terrible numbers, but nothing like the hundreds who died in traditional attacks. And while the Australians celebrated their success, American units 2 miles away were still trying to coordinate their own attack. They were still waiting for artillery support. They were still checking radio schedules. 2 days later, those American units were still stuck in the same positions, still waiting for orders, still dying in the same mud. Honor had proven his point. You could win with 60 rounds per man if those men could think. You could win without artillery if your soldiers could adapt. You could win by trusting smart people to make smart choices. The question was whether anyone else would listen. The numbers told a story that was hard to ignore. Before the Australians started using their section tactics, The Allied forces had spent 3 brutal weeks trying to break through the Japanese lines. 3 weeks of attacks. 3 weeks of men screaming and dying in the mud. In those 21 days, they had gained only 400 yards of ground. 400 yards. That is less than the length of 4 football fields. And the cost for those 400 yards was 2,800 Allied soldiers killed or wounded. 2,800 men. Some units lost almost everyone. Fathers, sons, brothers, all gone for a few yards of muddy jungle. Then the Australians changed how they fought. They stopped waiting for orders and started thinking for themselves. The results were stunning. In just 10 days, they achieved a complete breakthrough of the Japanese defences. 10 days instead of 3 weeks. And the casualties dropped to 1,200 men. 1,200 was still terrible. Every single one of those men mattered. But it was less than half of what had been lost before. The math was simple. The Australian way saved lives. It saved time. It won battles. By December 1942, American commanders who had mocked the Australians were suddenly asking questions. They sent observers to watch the Australian sections in action. They took notes. They asked the Australian sergeants to explain their thinking. Within weeks, 5 American battalions started training in the Australian section tactics. 3,000 American troops learned the new way to fight. They learned to trust themselves. They learned to move fast and think faster. They learned that sometimes the best order is no order at all. Just a target and the freedom to figure out how to reach it. But not everyone was happy about this change. MacArthur's staff officers hated admitting that their methods had failed. They hated that a bunch of schoolteacher commanders from Australia had figured out something West Point had missed, so they tried to discredit what the Australians had done. They wrote reports calling the victories lucky accidents. They said the Australians had just happened to find weak spots in the Japanese lines. They said that the section tactics worked only because of special circumstances that would never happen again. They insisted that traditional American discipline and coordination were still the right way to fight. They predicted that the Australian method would fail as soon as the Japanese adapted to it. The comparison between the two approaches could not have been more clear. The American 32nd Division kept using traditional tactics through most of December. They followed the rule book exactly. They waited for orders. They coordinated their attacks. They moved in formation. It took them 6 weeks to capture their objectives in the Buna area. 6 weeks of slow, bloody fighting. Meanwhile, the Australians, using independent section tactics, captured similar terrain in just 2 weeks. Same jungle, same enemy, same mud and rain and mosquitoes. The only difference was the method. 6 weeks versus 2 weeks. The evidence was overwhelming. American officers who actually saw the fighting knew the truth. Colonel Clarence Martin watched an Australian section attack a Japanese bunker one afternoon in early December. He wrote about it later in a letter that ended up in official Army records. He said, "I watched an Australian sergeant take a bunker with 4 men. He didn't call for orders. He didn't wait for support. He saw the opportunity, decided what to do, and acted immediately. It was beautiful and terrifying. Beautiful because it worked so perfectly. Terrifying because it was everything we'd been taught not to do. But it worked. That's the part nobody can argue with. It worked." The scene Martin described was repeated hundreds of times across the New Guinea campaign. Imagine standing in that jungle. The air is so hot and wet that breathing feels like drowning. The smell hits you first. Rotting plants mixed with the sharp stink of gunpowder smoke. Bodies that have been lying in the heat for days. Mud so thick it pulls your boots off your feet with every step. You can hear the buzz of insects so loud it sounds like machinery. Then the sharp crack of rifle fire cuts through everything else. An Australian section moves through tall kunai grass that grows higher than a man's head. They don't talk. Hand signals only. One man points left. Two soldiers move that direction without hesitation. Another man points right. Two more go that way. The sergeant in charge doesn't shout orders. He doesn't need to. Each soldier knows his job. Each man scans a different angle. They move like they share one brain. No hesitation. No confusion. Just trust. When they spot the Japanese bunker, they don't stop to call headquarters. They don't wait for permission. They see it. They plan it in seconds using only gestures. Then they move. Three men create noise on one side while two slip around to the back. Grenades fly through the bunker entrance. The fight is over in 90 seconds. 4 Australians just did what 50 Americans couldn't do in 3 days, and they did it without speaking a single word out loud. The Japanese defenders could not adapt to this new style of fighting. They had trained for years to defend against traditional military attacks. They knew how to fight enemies who moved in predictable patterns. They could counter artillery barrages. They could prepare for coordinated assaults. But the Australians gave them nothing predictable. The Japanese would prepare to defend the north side of their position, and the attack would come from the south. They would reinforce one bunker, and 3 others would get hit at the same time. They never knew where the next section would appear. They never knew when the attacks would come. The Japanese fought bravely, but their training had prepared them for the wrong kind of enemy. They could not defend against opponents who thought independently and moved unpredictably. By January 1943, the change was complete. 80% of all Allied infantry operations in New Guinea were using some form of the Australian decentralised command principles. 80%. That meant 4 out of every 5 attacks now trusted soldiers to think for themselves. American units that had lost the most men in the early fighting became the strongest supporters of the new tactics. They had learned the hard way that following rules blindly got you killed. They had watched Australians succeed by breaking those same rules. The evidence was written in blood and mud across every battlefield. Independence worked, trust worked, thinking worked better than just obeying. The transformation happened fast because the proof was undeniable. When young American lieutenants saw Australian sergeants winning battles with a handful of men, they wanted to learn how. When American privates watched Australians move through the jungle like ghosts, while American units announced themselves with radios and whistles, they understood something had to change. The old way was dying. The new way was winning. And in war, winning is the only argument that matters. The Australian section tactics did not disappear when World War II ended. Instead, they spread. They changed how armies around the world thought about command and control. After the war, military leaders studied what had happened in New Guinea. They read the reports. They interviewed the survivors. They asked a simple question. Why did giving soldiers less control actually make them more effective? The answer became the foundation for how modern soldiers are trained today. Through the 1950s and 60s, military academies started teaching different ideas about leadership. They still taught discipline. They still taught the importance of following orders. But they added something new. They taught commanders to give soldiers a mission and let them figure out how to complete it. Instead of telling a squad to move forward 50 yards, stop at the big tree, then wait for further instructions. Officers learned to say, capture that hill by sunset, and then trust their soldiers to find the best way to do it. This style of command had a name: mission-type orders. Give the goal, not the steps. Trust the people doing the work to know the work better than anyone sitting far away. By the 1980s, the United States Army officially adopted mission-type orders as standard doctrine. It became part of every training manual. Every young officer learned that micromanaging soldiers was a weakness, not a strength. They learned that the best leaders ask what needs to happen, not how it needs to happen. And when Army historians trace back where this idea came from, they found the same story every time. New Guinea, 1942. Australian soldiers fighting without waiting for permission. The connection was direct and undeniable. The way American forces fight today, the way NATO forces coordinate, the basic principles that guide modern infantry tactics, all of it traces back to that muddy jungle and those Australian sections moving through the trees. But what about Ralph Honor? What happened to the school teacher who changed warfare? He survived the war. That alone was remarkable. So many of the men he led did not make it home. Honor saw friends die. He made decisions that saved some lives and cost others. He carried those memories for the rest of his life. When the fighting ended in 1945, Honor did not stay in the military. He did not become a general. He did not write books about his tactics or give speeches about his victories. He went back to Australia and became a school teacher again. He taught history and English to teenagers in small towns. He lived a quiet life. He married. He raised a family. When people asked him about the war, he would talk about the men he served with, but rarely about himself. He did not think he had done anything special. He had just trusted good people to do good work. Honor died in 1994. He was 91 years old. Most of the world did not notice. There were no big ceremonies, no television specials about his life. In Australia, some veterans mourned him. Some newspapers ran small stories about his service, but outside of Australia, almost nobody knew his name. The man who had helped change modern warfare died without the recognition that other military innovators received. It seemed unfair. It seemed wrong. But maybe Honor would not have minded. He had never fought for glory. He had fought to keep his men alive. He had taught them to think, because thinking saved lives. That was enough for him. 5 years after his death, in 1999, the United States government finally recognized what Honor had done. They awarded him the Legion of Merit. It is one of the highest honors America gives to foreign soldiers. The award came 57 years after the battles in New Guinea, 57 years late, but it came. The citation explained that Honor's tactical innovations had influenced generations of American soldiers. It said that his trust in his men had saved countless lives, not just in World War II, but in every conflict since. The medal went to his family. Honor never knew he would receive it. But somewhere, maybe, he would have smiled at the thought that someone finally understood. The lessons from New Guinea reach far beyond the military. Think about how the modern world works. Special operations forces like the Navy SEALs or Army Rangers operate exactly like those Australian sections did. Small teams, clear missions, freedom to adapt, trust that the people on the ground know better than the people in headquarters. Emergency response teams work the same way. When firefighters rush into a burning building, the chief does not tell each firefighter where to step and when to spray water. The chief says, save who you can, and trust the team to figure out how. Even in business, the most successful companies have learned this lesson. They call it agile methodology. Give teams a goal. Give them resources. Then get out of their way and let them work. The principle is always the same. The people closest to the problem usually know how to solve it better than anyone else. What Honor understood in that jungle is something that hierarchies often forget. Control feels safe. When you can see everything, plan everything, order everything, you feel like you are preventing chaos. But that control is an illusion. Real situations are messy. They change faster than orders can travel. Radios fail. Plans fall apart. The unexpected happens constantly. And when it does, the organizations that win are not the ones with the best plans. They are the ones with people who can think and adapt without permission. Honor knew this because he had been a teacher. He had watched children learn that real understanding comes from thinking, not from memorizing. He had seen that students who could solve problems on their own learned faster and remembered longer, than students who just followed instructions. War was not that different from a classroom. You could not teach people to handle every situation. You could only teach them how to think when situations changed. The deeper truth is that discipline and initiative are not opposites. For decades, military leaders believed you could have one or the other. Either soldiers followed orders exactly and stayed organised, or they thought for themselves and created chaos. The Australians proved that was wrong. You could have both. In fact, you needed both. Discipline meant soldiers trained hard, learned their weapons, practiced their skills, and respected their teammates. Initiative meant soldiers used that training to make smart choices in the moment. Discipline without initiative created robots who failed when the plan failed. Initiative without discipline created chaos where everyone did whatever they wanted. But discipline and initiative together created something powerful. They created teams of people who could work together and think independently at the same time. The next time someone tells you that success requires perfect control and rigid procedures, remember those Australian soldiers in the New Guinea jungle. Remember men making split-second decisions without permission. Remember sergeants leading like generals and privates thinking like sergeants. Remember that they won battles the rule book said they would lose. They won because someone trusted them. They won because they were free to be smart. And maybe that is the lesson that matters most. Orders do not win battles in the mud and chaos. People do. And people fight best when they are trusted to think. That was true in 1942. It is still true today. It will be true tomorrow. Some lessons are timeless. Trust is one of them.